Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Worst Church Ever. Hello, Nathan. How are you today, sir?
Oh, great. I'm so glad that we could connect. I look forward to Mondays. Let's put it that way. I look forward to Mondays.
It's a nice change, isn't it?
Yeah, especially, and this is going to be broadcast a week late, but
Right.
right now, Chris and I are right on the daylight savings time change. And so this is not a Monday that it's particularly good for anyone in North America. But to have this to look forward to in the afternoon was terrific. How about
Yeah,
you?
definitely.
Is your household adjusting to the switch on the times?
Everybody except for my toddler, which is to be expected. So, yesterday, I don't know why, but I woke up with an hour less sleep and I went to bed later than I should have anyway. But I woke up and I was full of energy and I was full of energy all day and I was driving my kids nuts. They're like, "Why are you so chipper?" That was the word. So, why are you so awake? Because usually Sundays, it's hard to get out of bed. And when I come home from church, I usually at some point in the afternoon have to take a nap, but I didn't at all. I was just like, go. And that was without even any coffee or anything. So I don't know. It was weird. And I felt just really oddly energized. But my kids did not feel that way, nor did my wife. And our little guy was very confused when it came to nap time. And like, why am I so upset? And why am I not sleeping? But I don't want to sleep. Everything is wrong and weird. And I don't know. So you probably have some similar experiences with your four kids, right?
Yeah, I think the older ones in the past, what I've done is I've tried to prepare them for it by telling them to go to bed like a half hour earlier on like Friday or Saturday, and then like work their way into that 30 minutes at a time as opposed to one fell swoop. But this time I didn't do it that way. And I did have to wake some high schoolers up this morning. Even though their alarms went off, they refused to get up until about 15 minutes before their bus got here. So there was
Yeah.
that. And toddler's definitely confused, but he's going through a thing anyway. I don't know. Like they have these spurts where they fall in and out of those rhythms, and he's fallen out of the rhythm. So I don't know that it was necessarily daylight savings time related. But any moment now, he's going to be in a toddler bed instead of a crib because he
Oh
is
boy.
almost climbing out. So we have the toddler
Yes.
bed there. It's next to it. He can see it. We're getting him used to the idea. And so, yep, that's life for you. Trying to figure out how to recapture sleep schedules.
Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, would say life is going from one cage into another, going from the crib into the toddler bed, into school, into the workforce. The iron cage of capitalism is what he would have called that.
Yeah.
So,
So that said, I think one of the things that I was ill prepared for just in parenthood was how important a sleep routine is and how hard it is to get everyone on one.
oh
You know,
yeah.
you're like, oh, I'm going to have to learn how to change a diaper. I need to figure out how to feed a baby. I need to figure out how to, you know, help somebody learn how to talk or walk or whatever. Helping somebody learn how to sleep, that was one of the things that I had no context for at all.
Yeah.
Still don't. This is 16 years into it. Still don't know how to get anyone to sleep.
Hello and welcome back to Worst Church Ever. I am Chris.
And I'm Nathan.
And we're two lifelong friends navigating the intersections of the secular and sacred in this space every Monday, and all the days between in the course of our daily lives as husbands, fathers, and followers of Jesus, rejecting fundamentalism and exploring cycles of trauma and healing in the redemptive stories of Scripture and in the reflections of the sacred all around us.
So grab some baked goods and a cup of coffee, because it's time for a discussion at Worst Church Ever. Add your thoughts and comments online, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep the conversation going.
Last week, we talked about dreams, speaking of sleep. And now this week, we're going to talk about some other things, and one of which is the idea of fandom and how fandom might be part of our identity expressions. And for as long as we've been doing this podcast together, I've had a lot of stuff behind me that speaks to various fandoms. And today I'm wearing a hat that speaks to a fandom. If you're a Philadelphia fan in any way, shape, or form, you know what this hat is. But I wanted to talk with you, Nathan, about fandom because I saw something really interesting on Facebook the other day. Andrew Jones, not the baseball player for the Atlanta Braves, former baseball player for the Atlanta Braves, but Andrew Jones, also known as Tall, Skinny Kiwi, he's a New Zealander, and he was pretty well known 15, 20 years ago in the emerging church conversation. That included guys like Brian McLaren, and that movement and that group went in different directions in different ways. And some of those early people ended up being like really bizarrely fundamentalist hyper neo-Calvinists like Mark Driscoll. But then others really kept going in more, I think, generative, positive ways, in my opinion. Although not that they weren't without their own weird hangups, as we all
Yeah.
are.
All of us
I'm,
have them.
right. I'm gonna do an aside real quick. I was at an event at Princeton Seminary in 2008, and it was a couple scholars of American religion. Randall Balmer was one of them, and that's a name that you might recognize. He writes a lot about religion in the public space, and he was actually one of my professors in seminary. I didn't go to Princeton, but he was a professor I had when he was visiting at our seminary. He's great, really good guy, but he's definitely a scholar. So he was there, and then there were people like Shane Claiborne and Doug Paget and Bart Campolo, that's Tony Campolo's son. They were there. I was on a panel talking about politics. And this is, of course, in the summer before the November election, Barack Obama versus John McCain. So back then, to say that you might vote for a Republican did not mean that you aligned with January 6th ideology, right? It seemed like more of an open question, even among people who were skewing progressive, because John McCain wasn't some arch conservative. So anyway, they're having this discussion, this panel at Princeton Seminary, and Shane Claiborne, who I think he really likes to be contrarian, and so does Bark and Polo, by the way. But Shane's up there and he's saying, if we vote, and he's going on about if we vote,
That
and
is so
he
great.
gets
That is so Shane Claiborne.
yeah, and so he gets done, and Bart Campolo looks like the veins are gonna pop out of his head, and he's like, all respect, what do you mean if you vote?" And like he didn't go off, but I could tell that it was like he was like that. So now Bart Campolo, I've met him once or twice in person. I've corresponded with him a few times, not lately. And I think about him from time to time because his journey's been really interesting, and he's no longer identifies as a Christian. Last I knew, he was the humanist chaplain at USC, and he's got a journey and a story, and it's not my place to really talk about it because I don't know it firsthand. But I will say that in his days as part of the emerging church discussion, or whatever wing of that he occupied, I found a lot of what he had to say pretty helpful as a Christian, and I continue to. I'm appreciative of that, but I wanted to tell that little aside because there's always these personalities at play. Now, I don't know Andrew Jones, tall, skinny Kiwi, but I've always enjoyed his content online. I've always found him to be like just like a peaceful, steady presence in all of these discussions. So anyway, he posted this thing and he said, why is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but why is it that in most of the English speaking world, people will say, I like to ski, I like to surf, and I support Manchester United. But in America, people say, I am a skier, I am a surfer, and I am a Manchester United fan. And he was wondering about that language and how it's different in America versus other places where English is the primary language and where we share a lot of the same pop culture and a lot of the same hobbies, pastimes, activities. And so he wondered, is this a search for belonging? Is it a search for a stronger group identity? Maybe in a context in America where group identities are frayed or fraying. Somebody mentioned the book Bowling Alone by, was it Robert Putnam, I think, back in the late 90s, I think that came out, who talked about basically the crumbling of all of our institutions. The bowling league was his classic example. But so he put the question out there, and I just had this kind of visceral response, and I said, whatever else it is, and I want to know how this hits you, Nathan, whatever else it is, we Americans, I think, are taught from birth, and I don't think this is a conscious thing we're taught. I think it's a subconscious communication of ideals and of values. We're taught to fully occupy everything that we encounter. And so
Mm.
we fully occupy our jobs, we fully occupy our hobbies, but we also fully occupy North America, the continent, right? And we've also been taught to think that it's our role to fully occupy the world. And so I think there's this American projection of filling up unconquered space. And I think it comes from the founding of the colonial communities who were faced with this very scary frontier that was full of danger and death and want and famine and everything else. Never mind, okay, obvious to this discussion is the genocide, the displacement, all that stuff. That's all part of my point, is like, to the people who are founding these colonies, this is empty space for us to fill, right? there's a real failure there of them to see the humanity of the other when it comes to the Native Americans. But if you're already operating from that premise, okay, the continent's empty, we have to fill it. Or even if it's not empty, it's our job to tame it or to civilize it. And that really comes out of, I think, frontier anxieties, and it comes from certain interpretations of Christianity. Most notably, I mentioned Max Weber earlier. He talked about the Protestant work ethic and the idea that if you can occupy more and more, and if you have more and more signs of wealth and advancement, oh, that's all the proof you need that you are among God's secret elect that only God knows about. So you can't really know if you're elect according to hyper Calvinism, but if you're wealthy, you have a pretty good idea that you're blessed and you're okay. So I think it's all of that stuff in the American context, because many of our early American communities were founded not just because of economic needs, but also with philosophical predispositions that lend itself to a community where we need to fill everything up. What do you think? I took a long time to say that, but I'm really curious about your thoughts.
I'm going to respond to the last thing that you said about the idea of being rich shows that I'm one of the elect, that Calvinist mentality.
Yeah.
There's the rich man in Jesus where he says it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than it is for someone of wealth or someone of riches to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And so this idea that the prosperity gospel in its Calvinist form is the more successful and rich, and the more that God has expanded my estates, the more likely it is that God is the one that has expanded my estate. I don't know that lines up necessarily with Jesus. I don't know that it's necessarily contrary that we say that just because you're rich and wealthy means that you aren't a follower of Jesus either. Right. But I don't know that's the litmus test for whether or not you're following Jesus. So I'll just start with that.
Yeah, and I think obviously I would agree, but it's a fascinating sociological look. It's his interpretation of what's going on there. I mean, Max Weber is where we get that phrase Protestant work ethic. But what he really talked about was specifically not just Protestantism. He was talking about Calvinism specifically. So, yeah.
And we talked about this on, I think, the Christmas episode, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the idea that wassailing is this idea of this social dynamic where the poor can't be Christians, clearly. And you can see that worked out in not just prosperity gospel Christians, but there's the idea that if I am sick or ill, it's because I didn't pray hard enough. And that's just not true.
Yeah.
And that's, people get sick. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike, right? And some people get rich and they are completely ungodly, evil people. And some people get rich and it's because God has enabled them to do incredibly good things through the resources that they have. And it's not a litmus test one way or the other. So I would just start with that.
Sure.
Not exactly an answer to your question.
It's part of it. It's part of it. Because when I was responding to Andrew, I was saying, yeah, it's the frontier, it's socio-political, but it is also in the genetic material in a way of some of the spiritual traditions that founded the country.
Yeah, so, manifest destiny, I think we call it, right?
Yeah. That's certainly the expansion across the continent, and that we didn't outright always say this was like God's will, but that was certainly in the air for a lot of those people.
It's hard to ignore it.
Yeah.
Given those words, manifest destiny.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual phrase, even if you don't want to admit that it's a spiritual phrase.
That's right. That's well said.
Spiritual undertones to it, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing that I think of, when you were talking about occupying this and occupying that, I thought of Occupy Wall Street.
Of course.
Which, again, even though it's adjacent to, it's that idea that we are going to go and we're going to take over Wall Street. We're going to actually occupy it. We're going to sit there. And I still am not entirely sure what that was about, because just sitting there and occupying a space in the middle of downtown New York City and downtown Chicago, again, I wasn't anywhere near it, so I don't really understand it, but I couldn't quite understand how that was effective, because brokers are still going to like inside the building and doing their jobs just because you're sitting out here on the street. I know it's a protest that's ongoing, but it never really quite clicked with me. I guess maybe just calling attention to it and living downtown in the middle of all the financial districts was, again, that was a Shane Claiborne move right there. I still never quite understood that. But
I think you're right. I think the Occupy part of it was, we're going to make it a real pain in the butt for you to conduct business, because we're going to put right in front of your face the other 99%, and we're going to put up tents, and we're going to do all this stuff. And I guess in Portland, it went so far as to like that what was that zone called in Portland, where like the Portland Autonomous Zone or something like that.
That's right. That's right. They
Um,
made their own
wh-
space in the city, right?
which is, yeah, which I'm not equipped to talk about on this podcast because I've heard crazy things from people on the left and on the right about how that happened and the consequences of it. So I have no way of knowing what's true about that whole thing, but certainly that was a more radical application of the Occupy ethos, I would say.
Yeah. But that idea, though, of occupying skiing or occupying
Yeah.
whatever hobby, and I wonder if that's that you're not mistaken, that there's this idea that I can just go join this thing. It's almost an extension of that American dream. I am therefore a podcaster and I am a skier, and it's now part of my identity almost to the point where like someone else that wants to do it too, I need to compete with them as well. It's not just that we have a podcast, but we have to be the best podcast. Like we're going to start the worst church ever, and it has to be the best podcast, even though we're called the worst. And we need to have so many followers and so many views. And I don't know if that's just American. I'm sure that influencers and social media people all over the world have that same sort of idea. But it's, if I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to do it with excellence. So anyway, I think that's maybe part of it. I don't know. Is that American? Is that just how people are? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't really know if Andrew's right that in other parts of the English speaking world, they say it differently. Although anecdotally, I feel like I've heard British people say, I support Wrexham FC, and rather than I'm a Wrexham fan. I don't know. But I know that I would never say I support the Phillies. I would never say that. I would say I'm a Phillies fan or I'm a Phillies guy. But what's interesting is when it comes to profession, I feel very strange saying I'm a pastor. Right. And I don't know if that's because pastor has this connotation that I don't want to be associated with. I'm proud of what I do. Don't get me wrong. It's important and it's meaningful and it's good. But I feel like when I say I'm a pastor, people right away put you in some kind of box. And I can't tell you how many times in the course of just regular conversation, if somebody like drops the F-bomb, sorry, pastor, I'm like, like, it almost put Jesus was all about being downwardly mobile and relating to people. And then as soon as we become religious professionals, people want to like not be themselves around us. And I think that's what I'm reacting to there. But for you, do you think to yourself, I'm Nathan, I'm a corporate trainer? Or do you think my job is
Never.
I work for, I wonder if that would be different if we had different jobs. There's this guy for the Angels, Anthony Rendon, who had a couple really good years. He's a baseball player. But lately he's been taking flack for saying baseball is my job, but my faith and my family are more important to me than baseball. And people want to tear this guy apart for saying that because do you know how many people would kill to have your job? Blah, 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 blah. And I get all that. But at the same time, he has the healthy perspective. Even though you have a dream job, it is a job and it is how you feed your family. But it's probably very good that it's not the totality of your identity. Like Tom Brady is probably only a football player.
Correct.
And he was willing to end his family because of that. I know I'm being judgmental and presumptuous, but you get what I'm saying. On the other end of that, we tear this guy down because he admits that baseball is not the most important thing in his universe.
There's a question behind the people that attack that person, as if they're saying you're occupying a space that you don't appreciate and someone else deserves it more if you don't appreciate it or you don't want it as much as someone else does. And I don't think that's necessarily true either. I might want to be a professional musician, but it's not like if Wilco didn't exist that I'd get to be one. It's not like there's only 17 spots for musicians and this one's taken. And
That's
so
right.
therefore, like if one of them retires, then you might have a shot. No, it's like some people get to do that and some people don't because of connections and talents and exposure and being in the right place in the right time and all that other stuff. And some people, it doesn't matter how talented they are, they're never going to get it because they have the opposite. Or it just aren't talented in that area. And so I think there is another American thing to say, if I want it bad enough, manifest destiny, I should be able to manifest that destiny. And you're getting in my way because you have that spot. You have that
Yeah.
role.
Yeah. That's a great point. So Manifest Destiny not only has some sort of spiritual overtones in its original application, but in this day and age, people talk about, I'm going to manifest this, that, and the other. And so now it has this sort of weird metaphysical component to it. And you're exactly right. People look at, and in this case, Anthony Rendon, and they say, you must not deserve it because you don't appreciate it the way that I think I would appreciate it. Never mind the fact that he is not taking your spot. Okay. I am 5'8" on a good day. I would never make it in the MLB, and I know that. And I didn't really realize that until I met some professional baseball players that I'm like, why are you so tall? But so I think a lot of these people are on Reddit and they're just unhappy about their lives and whatever else. But yeah, we create this false narrative that, oh, he may have all the physical gifts, he may have all the skill, the coordination, the muscle memory, he might have the right mentality in the batter's box or on the pitcher's mound. But part of earning that spot is also appreciating it. And therefore, there's going to be someone, even if it's not me, who's more deserving than him. And he's blocking their blessing or some bullcrap like that. There are people who are brilliant in any number of fields that we will never know about. There are brilliant musicians, brilliant painters, writers, who, whatever it is, athletes, who will never get the shot or will have, for whatever reason, the shot didn't work out. Have you ever seen Rick Beato talk about when he pissed off Creed?
No, but I want to now. Since we're done with this, because Rick Beato's one of my heroes.
I think it might not have been him. It might have been the lead singer. So he had that band called Billionaire in the
That's
90s.
Right.
And I think they had some moderate success and started to open at festivals and stuff. And then they started to open for Creed at one point in 99, 2000. So at the height of Creed or whatever. And I guess they went and played a show at this dive bar after they had opened for Creed. And it was in the same town. Maybe it was the next night, or maybe there was like a night between show, something where they had a moment off during the tour, but it was still on tour, but they played at some bar. And they were doing all their songs. The crowd was loving it. And the lead singer started to talk about Creed and make fun of Creed and how bad Creed is and all this other stuff. And freaking Scott Stapp was in the audience. He was at the bar there to like basically support this young upcoming band. And they're shitting all over Creed. And Rick Beato said doors closed overnight for them. And that wasn't Rick's fault. That was the lead singer who had the big mouth. And it's stuff like that. Like, Rick Beato's brilliant. Now, he found his audience at the age of 60. You know what I mean? But it took a long time of him working really hard in many other avenues. So
my favorite thing about Rick Beato is he'll have these YouTube tutorials on how to do something on the guitar. And he'll say, quick lesson, when you're soloing over B flat minor, a really easy way to make the lick is by adding a 7th, 9th into it. Like, I'm making these words up, but and then it'll play some like virtuoso line and be like that. And it's like, yeah, exactly. With like that, like, you know, after 60 years of practice and being a college professor and playing with a touring rock band, it'll be really easy for you. Just, it's simple. It's an easy lesson for you. Oh man. I think it's just a chance for him to play his guitar and show off for everybody. But it's so good. Like,
he's great. I love his channel.
Oh no, I wish that Rick Beato was still accessible as a producer. I don't think he's going to do any producing anymore because his YouTube channels. Not that I would ever have him as a producer anyway, because I'm not somebody that would ever be able to afford that. But that's like a dream. Like, oh man, if Rick Beato could produce anything, that would be so cool. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So he is a producer, or he gets to produce for work? He is a YouTuber, or his job is YouTubing? That's kind of what we're talking about. Do I like Rick Beato, or am I a Rick Beato fan?
Do I subscribe to Rick Beato, or am I a Rick Beato guy?
The other flip side is, and I'm going to minimize everything for a minute and just say American English is just different from a dictation perspective than Australian and European English.
The question is why? Is that just because of which people lived here and codified how we speak, or does it speak to some sort of psychological thing in the air when we were figuring out how to have American dialect? And it's probably both.
Like, we don't add an R to the end of banana either, but in Europe they certainly do. It's a banana. Like, there's no R in banana. How can you have an R in the end in banana? And yet that's what they put in the middle of a banana.
Now, is that always, or is that only if the next word starts with a vowel? Because that I've heard a lot, like vodka and
No,
tonic,
no, no.
right? And they do that in New England and in Brooklyn also, adding that R, but only if it's between, usually only if it's between, if the next word's a vowel, because
Yeah.
there's, I forget, I love to read Wikipedia stuff about pronunciations, but I can never figure out what I'm reading because there's this whole other language of phrases and symbols that I don't understand, but I think it's fascinating. So,
The main accent, not the one that I have because I'm a transplant from elsewhere, but the main accent, the traditional one, is like even more extreme than the Boston accent. And
okay.
there was a woman that was at my church that led the hymns because we'd have some like more like guitar led modern worship songs, but then they'd have a piano and organ hymn every week too, to make sure that people that grew up with that still feel like they're included. And I think that's appropriate, by the way. I think that's
Yeah.
not a bad thing. But she'd get up there, and I can't do the accent justice, but turning your hymnals to hymn numbers 475. Like it was like deep Maine accent. And I was like, oh, that is so cool.
I remember, do you remember, it didn't last long, but Dana Carvey had a variety show in the 90s called The Dana Carvey Show. And Stephen Carell and Stephen Colbert, Steve Carell and Stephen
I
Colbert were
didn't
both
know that
on
they
it.
were on that.
They were. And I'll never forget this one skit. And it was like New England Rednecks, was it? Or no, New England Neo-Nazis was
Oh,
what it was
yeah.
the skit.
Both of them are up here.
Yeah. 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 And
I am not
this
part
is
of
not
either community, just to be clear.
yeah. But that's my only point of reference for the main accent. So it was like, well, what you doing now? You know, and the guy's like, Woodland. I'm not going to get into the punchline because it's so gross because it's a skit about neo-Nazis. But my only experience with the main accent is, sitting on the porch, and I'm Woodland. Is that close, or am
Yeah,
I butchering
I think
it?
it's close to me, actually. I think you got it. Stephen King is from up here. That's
Mm-hmm.
where he's from, Bangor, Maine. And so if you read Stephen King novels, a lot of them take place in Maine. And so,
Yep.
so you're like reading.
Yup.
So when you're reading
Sorry.
that, you have to put that accent on 90% of what he's doing because that's how people sound up here. I don't. That's missing from most of the interpretations, by the way. Shining in the movie took place in like Colorado, but in the real, I think it took place in Maine in the actual novel. So you have to have that Jack Torrance character going like with that Maine accent, and that really puts you in the mood for it.
Here's Johnny. You've had your whole life to think about it.
I never really thought about that until I was listening to one of the audiobooks that he had written, and that it was being interpreted by a guy who could do the Maine accent. And so it was the Stephen King book where they go back in time to try to stop the JFK assassination.
Yeah.
I always forget what it is, 11 something, because it's the day that
It's the date. Yeah.
the date. I always forget what it is, but it's 11 whatever. So he goes back in time to like, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to ruin the book for you, but
That's okay.
yeah, and you can hear like the accent dialogues that he's doing with all the characters, and I'm like, oh, that's what this is supposed to sound like. That's what Derry, Maine sounds like. So when it is there, you need to put that New England Maine accent on top of everything, and it's a lot more interesting. It may not be as enjoyable for everyone that's not from up here, but it certainly is fun to see that and go, oh yeah, I can hear it.
So two thoughts I have. One is, now I'm just spinning out on this. So Stand By Me. Now I'm thinking, you want to go see a dead body? But that also leads me to think about, so Bruce Springsteen, not from Maine, but from New Jersey, but he has one song where I swear he's Pennsylvania Dutch. The song is called Going Down. And about a quarter into it, he gives up pronouncing the word down, and he starts saying dawn. And that's how Pennsylvania Dutch people say, I'm going dawn.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like, I'm going dawn. I'm like, he picked that up from all of his Pennsylvania connections because he played here a lot as a young man.
He knows.
So he probably has some PA Dutch ancestors. A lot of transfer between Jersey and PA. So
it is always fun when you have that. It's, again, it doesn't take away from it when you don't understand the cultural context or how things sound. But I feel the same way. Like, we talked about Wonka a couple of episodes ago. And in the movie that came out when we were kids, or actually probably before we were born, but the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, there's some characters that have a very clear English accent, and then other characters like Gene Wilder who do not have an English accent. But then you're like, oh, Roald Dahl was actually English. And so it would make sense for all of these characters to be talking with a British accent.
Right.
Not Gene Wilder's forte, apparently, because he doesn't going to speak with a British accent. But maybe that made him more interesting because half the characters do have that British accent and that he doesn't. It makes them different. So in England, it probably was like, oh, yeah, that's great. But for everyone else, it's, wait, so Gene Wilder's an American, Willy Wonka's American. What are all these British kids doing at the factory?
And where is the factory, by the way? Like,
Charlie's got this definite. Actually, did Charlie have an English accent?
I think Charlie had an American accent. I think. I can't remember now, but I do know that Tommy Television or Tommy TV, whatever his name was,
he was definitely American
by design in the book and everywhere else.
He was American for sure. But then he had the Violet Beauregard character.
She was definitely British, right?
Definitely British. Daddy, I want the squirrel.
I want. Yeah.
The egg. It was the egg. Sorry.
Or was that? And then which one was Veruca Salt? Was Veruca Salt the one who wanted everything, and Violet was the one who was turning? You're turning Violet.
That's right. That's right. Violet Gold. Yeah, Veruca Salt was the one that wanted everything.
Yeah. And that was a female-led band in the '90s, right? Veruca Salt.
Yeah, Veruca Salt.
To that point about Tommy TV or whatever his name is being like a jab at the American stereotypes. I heard Noel Gallagher talking about Taylor Swift the other day, and he's not a fan because he has to be provocative. He is like, and her name, Taylor Swift. It's so American. I was like, you know what? If I had to invent an American pop star name, Taylor Swift would be up there. That's a really awesome American pop star name, Taylor Swift.
And if we had to invent a British name, Noel and Liam Gallagher would be up there on the list of names that we'd invent for a British musician too.
It's so perfect you couldn't make it up. Only their parents could make it up.
That's right. Not Noel.
No,
Noel.
not. Oh my gosh. And Declan McManus, but he chooses to go by Elvis Costello. So what are you going to do?
That's right. Can Noel not just appreciate anything? He's the one that embodies the American dream more than anyone else. I'm going to occupy the space of rock and roll to the point where no one else can have it. Like that's even my brother, whose family, no one else can be rock and roll except for me.
You're right, and that's why I'm Team Liam. Even though I love Noel, but yeah, you're exactly right. That's really well said. Did you see the a couple years ago when he was feuding with Louis Capaldi?
No, but
oh my gosh,
who is he not feuded with?
Yeah, Louis Capaldi is brilliant. First of all, I think he's a great musician and songwriter. But when you listen to him in interviews, he's hilarious, and he knows it, right? And he has a very thick Scottish accent, which makes it that much more delightful. But for some reason, Noel took a swipe at him in the media, and Louis Capaldi was like, first of all, I love Noel Gallagher, and I finally made it. Like, he took a swipe at me. That means I'm legit. So at the next festival that he was at, Louis Capaldi came out dressed as Liam because he had the parka and he had the bucket hat. And he did the whole Liam swagger and everything like that. And then he came up to the microphone and opened up his parka, and there was a picture of Noel with a heart around it.
That's awesome.
So then I don't remember if Noel responded or not, but then Louis Capaldi upped the ante and he went and found Noel's daughter and took pictures of Noel's daughter kissing him and stuff. Consensual, by the way, but that's like the ultimate flex right there. I think it's pretty funny.
You're like, no, I want you to like me so badly that I married your daughter just to try to get in your good graces. Could you please like me?
That's right.
No, that probably wouldn't work. Most father-in-laws are not particularly fans of their son-in-laws. So
let's get personal. Does your father-in-law like you?
Maybe the exception. I think he tolerates me. Let's put it that way.
There you go.
How about yours?
I feel like that might be the best we can do as men is tolerate
our son-in-laws or father-in-law.
Yeah.
I don't know. How about, does yours tolerate you or enjoy you?
I think he likes me. I like him. I think he likes me. But then again, I think everybody likes me. So.
Yeah, there's that. Yeah. The American version of that, getting either retweeted or tweeted at by Donald Trump, is the equivalent of making it in politics. One way or the other. You get retweeted or tweeted at. Yeah. Or tweet mentioned with either intense like or dislike. That's your litmus test of whether or not you've made it in American politics.
And I think then if there's anything beyond that, it's getting a nickname from Donald Trump.
Yes, if you have a nickname, that means you've made
it. Sometimes they destroy your political career. Little Marco, we call him Little Marco.
But I think it's the
That
same thing as Louis Capaldi. It's like you're like hoping, like if I get a nickname, that means I'm in. Like
yeah, yeah,
in
exactly.
either side, like if I get a nickname as a Republican or of a Democrat, like the fact that I've got named
That's
by
right.
this entity means that I've made it
Yep,
somehow in the
yep,
world. So yeah, that's the same. Like Knoll is the litmus test for whether or not you've made it in rock and roll, at least in
yeah,
Europe. I don't know that
yeah.
anybody in the
Yeah.
United States cares as much anymore
No,
about
and
what
it's
Noel
so
Gallagher
funny
thinks.
how so many of those bands that are mega, as they say in the UK, are also really huge in South America for some reason.
Yeah,
Like,
Coldplay,
yeah, Coldplay,
um,
Oasis, still a lot of those
massive,
bands.
massive.
Yeah, yeah, yep.
I
You know,
think it's
you could,
interesting as Americans that we have bands that we just don't even consider as being an entity because they
yeah,
haven't made it in the United States, and yet they're massive everywhere else. You go see
that's right.
like shows from these other European bands, and they're just uh, they're huge, and yet we're like, who?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
have
it's
no idea who that
interesting.
is.
And it's because we have a whole freaking continent, and to really make it globally, you almost have to make it here, almost.
We
But
occupy our musicians as well. Is that
yeah, yeah, and it's funny too. So Liam Gallagher and John Squire have a #1 record now. It went #1, and it's like Liam's sixth or fifth or sixth solo #1 in the UK.
yeah?
And I was like, "What's your population? Like 10 million? I don't know." And I'm not saying it's not a great accomplishment. It is a great accomplishment, but yeah, we almost even. I'm a huge fan, and I'm kind of like, I don't know. There's an asterisk there, buddy.
A few weeks ago when that came out, I was live texting Chris my play by play as I listened through the album, and I made it about halfway through, and I was like just processing it as I was listening to the songs, and I think it was probably super annoying from him that he got a text from me every
I
couple
loved
minutes.
it. I loved it. It was
But yeah,
both
it was funny. It wasn't
insightful
funny. I
and
just didn't.
spoiler free. It was great. It was
Yeah, I was
great.
trying not to ruin it, but I was like, halfway through one of these songs, yeah, that's boring. Wait, oh, that's cool.
Yeah, yeah,
Finally, it changed tempos after 6 songs or whatever it was. It's not it for what it is. It's a pretty good record, but I
yeah.
don't know that if that had come out instead of Oasis, that any of us would be fans of Liam
Sure,
and John. Like,
sure. It's like in the Rolling Stones will make an album even now, and at least in when they made albums in the '90s, they were in their 50s, and a lot of it would be filler, but there'd be a couple songs where you're like, yeah, that song's awesome. So they can still pull one out of their hat. You know what I mean?
yeah,
So
it's interesting. And I was saying this to you first time I'm saying it out loud to anybody else, but I think that Noel is technically not as good at guitar, but somehow he's better for Liam.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And
There's
that's
an
that whole
unpolished presence to Oasis that's like raw and rock, and then it's technically better guitar playing,
sure.
but it's not as memorable.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
the licks are greater, but they're not more memorable.
Right. Yeah. I get
So
that completely. Yeah.
yeah, but there are some places when I was just like, that is amazing. That made that song just that was so good. So it's worth listening to, I guess, for at least a couple of moments. I
Yeah.
feel the same way though about Roger Waters. You're talking about like people that make records later in life.
Yeah.
Like Roger Waters and David Gilmour on Pink Floyd records, incredibly good. In fact, like I'm even okay with like the later parts of their career. The Final Cut is, even though that's technically a Pink Floyd record, a lot of people call that Roger Waters' first record because David Gilmour had very little to do with it, and they had fired Richard Wright as the keyboard player and then hired him back to do the keyboard part. So it's very much, this is a Roger Waters that Pink Floyd's playing on.
Yeah.
It's actually one of my favorite compositions. But then fast forward to more recent years, and the guy's like in his 70s, and it's like music out of time. Like it doesn't, it's good, but it also feels like 60s and 70s and 80s music, just with better production on it. And the world's changed and moved on, and yet here's another Roger Waters record.
Yeah. And do you think there's something to like a creative window, and not that you can't be massively creative when you're older, but the idea that like when you're younger, your artistic vision and maybe even your, I don't want to say your artistic integrity, but it's pacing with the fact that you're hungry and you have a certain amount of idealism that maybe you lose as you get older. And there's, I don't know, everything seems more urgent in your 20s and 30s maybe than it does as you get older. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that there's few people that can pull it off like Cher does. Cher was able to do it like consistently almost every decade she's had, up until I don't know if she's had a major hit since Believe.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, like that's an enormous amount of space from I Got You Babe to Believe. And then there's so many songs in between to be able to
Yeah.
reinvent yourself. I don't remember how old she was, but it was 50s or 60s, I think, when she put that
Yeah.
song out. And it's,
Absolutely.
oh
Yeah.
man, like that song. I know it's like that song's now 24 years old or whatever, maybe even 25 years old, because I think it came out in 99.
I think
And
so.
it was the first use of auto tune where it like is clearly like used to modulate the voice, not just enhance it.
Yeah.
That changed the entire music. I think that's still being used today. Like people are using that particular effect to make their voice modulate 25 years later. That
Yeah.
was a profoundly important moment. Not everybody's able to reinvent themselves over and over again to the point where they can be relevant
Yeah.
to the next generation. So when you can do it, hats off. And when you can't, that's okay. Still had a longer musical career than most of us did. If you had one hit wonder or 10 albums worth.
That's a great point, is we so diminish people who have that one great hit or again, Oasis. You can make the argument they had 2 perfect albums and the rest of the stuff they did was just hit and miss.
Still
But
2
then
perfect albums.
you forget that they had 2 perfect albums, right? Yeah. Or even, like I said, a one hit wonder. Do you know how hard it is to write a pop single, a rock single, whatever, that first of all makes it through all of those machinations and then connects with an audience? Like, that's a tremendous achievement.
What's your favorite one hit wonder, by the way? What's your favorite like song that is this is the only song from this artist and none of the other ones exist?
Oh, good question. A classic one that comes to mind would be like 96 Tears by Question Mark and the Mysterians from the 60s. As far as one hit wonder, let's do it this way. American charts, I'm going to say Laid by James, because that was their only hit here, but they have a robust career everywhere else
Yeah.
in the world to this day. I have to think a little bit more because I know there are a couple that are just like, damn, that song just hits different.
I think mine's maybe In the Meantime by Space Hog.
That is such a good answer. In fact, did you listen to the podcast where I quoted that song extensively?
I didn't. Now I need to go back. We need to find out which episode that is and put it in the show notes because I need to go back and look at that.
All of you. That's a great
line.
Yeah. Freaking great song. Along those lines, Got You Where I Want You by The Flies would be up there for me.
I knew that was your answer before you answered it. So I was waiting for you to say that because that song makes it on your Facebook page every time it comes on Sirius XM radio. You take a picture of it and you put it on there.
Because it's Katie Holmes, and that song is the summer of 1998, which for us was the summer between senior year of high school and going off to college.
That's great.
That song is that feeling.
Yeah. It's very much the graduated feeling that you just can't get anywhere else.
Exactly.
That's a good song too. I really like that one. Yeah, but there was a lot of those in the 90s. Not that there aren't anymore, but I think there was a lot of one-hit wonders in the 90s.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Oh man, I'm going to think about this. We'll talk about this more next time because we should both make a top 10 list, your top 10 one-hit wonders. And you're right, so many of them were amazing 90s songs. So.
Yeah, a lot of them were.
What was that band? Primitive Radio Gods, that guy at the telephone booth. That was a great song.
Yeah.
Sampled B.B. King. Yeah.
So many of them. I've enjoyed quite a bit more of Semisonic than Closing Time. I would think a lot of people would say that Closing Time is the song from Semisonic. They had a number of other things that I think made at least charted. Yeah. Not number one, but charted. I actually enjoy All About Chemistry. I enjoy that whole album as an experience better than I enjoy Closing Time as a single. But I think I'm in the minority there. I think most people think that Closing Time is this great song, and then they look at the rest of it and they're like, eh. But man, that guy's a really incredible songwriter, and he actually still is writing music for a lot of pop stars right now. Like I think he's...
Is that right?
Yeah, so he has a whole record out of cover songs of songs I wrote or something like that, where it's like he wrote the songs for other artists, and now he's doing his own version of the songs that he wrote for other people. So it's, I don't remember what he called it, a cover song.
Yeah, I love that. That's like
covering
a Willie
myself
Nelson
or
move.
something.
Yeah. What's a great, I think we may have talked about this years ago, but Marcy Playground.
Oh yeah. Sex and Candy.
That was their big hit, but they have an acoustic album where they cover a lot of things, and there's some solos on there, originals, and that's really good. It's really good. I forget. It's some really well-known acoustic songs that I'm blanking. I don't think they do Hallelujah, but I think they might do. I can't remember now, but if you look it up, you'll see what I mean, and it's really good. Do you remember Razorblade Suitcase by Bush?
Yeah.
That was their follow-up to 16 Stone. And I was listening to the classic rock station the other night on the local radio, and they always do 90s at 9. And it was one thing when they were playing songs from the early 90s, but now they're getting into the later 90s, and I'm getting pissed because it's like, how old am I? But so they did Swallowed, and I never really realized that there's this phrasing in that song with the guitars that I'm pretty sure Coldplay directly lifted for Yellow. It's that background
Ugh.
bright burst of guitar. And if you listen to them side by side, which I haven't done, but in my head, I'm like, wow, that sounds like Yellow. Totally different songs, totally different vibes, different melodies, but just that there's this background guitar burst in chord structure. I'm like, that's Coldplay. But it's 5 years before Coldplay. So
When you hear it, it's hard to unhear it.
yeah.
Even if it wasn't directly plagiarized from, you can be like, okay, we're definitely listening to the same music when they wrote that particular chord, or
Absolutely.
they wrote that next thing. Yeah.
We repeat
good.
our motifs, we repeat our traumas, and we repeat, if we're healthy, sometimes we repeat our inspirations too, right?
There's only so many chords and only so many notes, so it's like you can't avoid it. It's gonna happen.
That's why Ed Sheeran won that court case. First of all, he was right. Second of all, there's only so many ways you can go.
Yeah, because there's any chord progression sounds like a lot of other chord progressions. I think Ed Sheeran even did that during the trial where he like played it and said, I can play like 7 other songs I can sing to this same riff.
Yeah.
It's true. You can't copyright a chord progression. You can, I guess you could try, but
yeah,
thankfully you can't, because that's actually what was at stake there, is if you can copyright a chord progression, you're limiting the amount of creativity that people can have. And again, you should be able to have your own creative control over your work. And if you write something like Let's Get It On, and then you blatantly cover Let's Get It On and pass it off as your own work, that's a different story. But if you just happen to have similar chords and it happens to be slow, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily plagiarizing Let's Get It On.
That's right.
Was that the song? I think that was the song he was plagiarizing, right?
I believe.
Allegedly.
I think that's right.
Him and everyone else, because I think the Marvin Gaye estate has sued many people for trying to steal his chord progressions.
You know what? Ed Sheeran is just trying to get back to the Shire in one piece. Just leave him. He went and got the one ring and threw it into the pits of Mordor for you, and you're going to sue him? Come on.
Oh man. It's true. He does look like he should have been on Mountain Doom with Frodo and Sam.
And that's not an insult. He just looks like those guys. He looks like Charlie from Lost.
Looks like he belongs. Charlie.
Oh, Charlie. You all, everybody.
So, have you seen an interview with him lately? His voice has become very raspy.
Really?
And very low. I don't know if he just smoked a lot of cigarettes or whatever, or if he like yelled a little too much at a Yankees game or something and just blew his voice out, or if it was singing "You All Everybody" too many times. But he doesn't sound the same.
I like to think it was that, like, he goes to like house parties in the Hollywood Hills and he gets up on a table with a red solo cup and is "You all everybody." It just goes from party to party.
That was so clearly aimed at Oasis.
Yeah. Oh, but they admit that. Yeah, absolutely.
It was so clearly that is Charlie is Noel.
Yep.
And his brother, who I forget the name, is the Liam character. You've got the person that's writing the songs, and you got the person's.
Right. And actually, the brother's name is Liam. I'm pretty sure. I think they even did that.
I don't remember if it was or not, but yeah, it's definitely. Although in this world, in the Lost world, Liam definitely is not as interested in being a rock star as Charlie was.
Yeah.
But every time I think of Charlie from Lost, I always think of that YouTube skit as well. Charlie bit my finger. It's not related at all, but they're both. Charlie,
it's still hurting.
It's still hurting. Oh, Charlie.
Yeah, it hurts. And it's still hurting. And I love that he doesn't say it still hurts. He says it's still hurting. It's perfect. It's so good.
He bit my finger. And that really hurt, Charlie. He like sticks his finger back in his and the baby's like he's like
oh, it's so
oblivious to the pain he's causing his brother.
Oh yeah.
So beautiful.
He's just gleeful.
Speaking of YouTube, I don't watch Saturday Night Live. I watch it on YouTube Repeat or whatever the NBC app is. And
Yep.
so I was watching the recap of last episode, and they had a skit that was almost a little too personal for me. It was the people pleasers bit where they're in therapy for being people pleasers. And I am a people pleaser to the point where sometimes someone also will express an opinion, and I'm very quick to jump on board with it. And sometimes I wonder if it's because I just like the idea of community and
Mm.
finding that belonging, like the people in the skit where they just couldn't. Anytime someone would present any counter opinion, every single person in the skit would jump on it. At the end of it, they have a little prayer, which was even more triggering for me because as they're praying, all of a sudden I was hearing myself pray again. And this is parody, so it's not exactly how my prayers go, but this, I want this, but only if you want it, God, but maybe not. If I want it too badly, let me know. But if I don't want it enough, then, it's this second guessing of self. And I think there's an important thing as people that like follow Jesus to understand that like aligning yourself with the gospel and aligning yourself with the things of God is important. And sometimes it's self-sacrifice. But there's also this other part that's unhealthy where it's not necessarily that you're doing that. It's just that you have no sense of identity yourself and you're just trying to figure out like how to make other people feel like they're safe so that you don't lose connection with them, even if you might need to.
Mm.
And there's like a razor's edge between self-sacrifice and obedience and losing oneself needlessly because of wanting that connection and not being able to get it. So I don't know what you think about that. And if you've seen that play out in religious organizations, but I think there is like a level of spiritual applications / spiritual abuse that can take place depending on what side of that razor you're on.
Yes. Yes. And it's really hard because a lot of times there are a lot of expressions of Christianity that really weigh heavily the idea that we are to die to ourselves, right? And that it's not my will, but your will be done, as I think we talked about offline. And it's hard to articulate in a meaningful way that can hit people at different spots on their journey and in their brain development. It's hard to key in on one message that deals suitably and responsibly with all the nuance of that thin razor's edge. It even has permutations in things like forgiveness and in being there for people. You mentioned about breaking connections that maybe you should break. A lot of times in church, when I'm preaching about this kind of thing, I say, we need to be forgiving, we need to be there for one another, and so on. And then I always have to remember to also say, by the way, if you're in a relationship that's toxic, this part doesn't apply to you. Leave. If your spouse is abusive, leave. If that person is always just dragging you down, have a boundary. So embrace is a holy expression of following Jesus, but boundaries can also, and boundaries are holy because boundaries help us stay healthy. So how do you have proper boundaries, but also have a heart that's open to the radical embrace that Jesus invites us into? And I think that you can't do it through literalism or through, I don't know, a one size fits all mentality. I think you really have to be working hard to let God build the spirit of Christ and the mind of Christ in you to be able to have discernment and wisdom. And that's incredibly hard because we're all broken and we all have frailties and we all have reasons that are not logical or spiritual for why we stay in bad relationships, bad situations, bad jobs, the whole 9 yards. And it's not just a matter of have more faith and step out of that situation. No, there are ingrained trauma responses that can keep us there. And I try to speak to that spectrum of reality, but it requires what you said. It requires relationship with people. I can't get up on a podium in front of 10,000 strangers and tell them how to live their lives. But if I'm cultivating relationship in community as their pastor or as their friend or as a fellow congregant, that's different because you build trust, you build a history together. And I think you're more equipped to discern together what's healthy in one situation and what might be different in another. I think that's how I'm learning to approach it, but that's a lifelong process.
Yeah, I think when it comes to things of faith, how can I even deny self if I don't know what self is? And that may be for the person that's that people pleaser, like this skit was sending up. Like, they don't really even have a self identity. Their identity is whoever they happen to be with. They're just mirroring whatever they think someone wants because they're so desperate for relationship with anybody that the
Right.
idea of making anybody angry, it might just be rooted in whatever those trauma reactions you have. If someone's upset with me or someone gets angry, that means that there's danger or there's loss of connection, there's loss of relationship, which is intolerable for my spirit because of whatever that history I have. So if I'm in a place like that's not healthy, right, and I need to develop that self, that's not unbiblical to figure out who that person is, because I can't deny that person if I don't know who that person is, right? I have to be
Well,
self-aware.
Nathan, you're saying exactly what Jesus said, but you're putting more meat on the bones. And I think you're right to do so. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. You have to love yourself to be able to love your neighbor, right? You have to have a self that you're in tune with and in touch with, that is connected to the holy, so that you can then exude that and to others in that act of embrace. It's not love your neighbor instead of yourself. Jesus never says that. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Well, you and I have both come out of more fundamentalist or conservative thought patterns, and I think, and sometimes either one of us are further from that or closer to that, depending on the day, probably.
Yes.
But that idea of loving yourself, self-love, is so diametrically opposed to what Christianity supposedly teaches. And yet Jesus is saying self-love.
Treat
Not,
yourself.
yeah, treat yourself. Not, I don't think it's not idolatry of self, though. That's
No.
different. Loving someone and loving yourself is not the same as pride. Going too far down the road is like pride of self and contempt for others. That's not healthy.
No.
So you can go to the other side where it's you have such good boundaries that you are unaware of the rest of the world. You can become a narcissist where it's just you can't see anyone other than yourself. You are
Right.
looking at your own reflection and admiring the greatness of who you are. That is not self-love. And in fact, the tragedy of Narcissus is that he dies looking at himself.
Yeah.
Like he's so wrapped up in self that he starves.
That is one of those stories that is obviously fiction, but is obviously true, right?
And Echo, who's watching him from afar, also just becomes nothing because she can't stop looking at him. I'm not sure how many people remember that story, but you got Narcissus, who is obviously looking at himself infatuated. He's been cursed to do that, in fact. And then you've got this other nymph that is so absorbed in Narcissus that she literally just disappears and becomes this like enigma of the forest, of an echo, so to speak. Guess where that name comes from. So either side of that, either such self-love that you die from malnourishment, or selflessness that you embody nothing but otherness. Neither one of those are healthy. There's a sense of, I need to know an accurate picture of the world. I need to know who I am as well.
To think that, people who think that ancient people were not very sophisticated, some Greek person somewhere or some community or some tradition came up with that story that is absolutely such an insight into the pitfalls of being a narcissist and also tying yourself to the fate of a narcissist. And we see in relationships all the time, not only does the narcissist suffer, but life is hell for the person that's with that narcissist or the people that are in that narcissist path. It's a lot of complexity, and it's very, very, very insightful. And the fact that Narcissus is cursed to be in that situation, he earns that curse, right?
It sure does.
It's a reminder to us that when we're now in that mode, we feel so cursed that we can't do anything else.
Yeah.
Even
though Echo wasn't cursed in the same way that Narcissus was, in a sense, she was tied to that curse because of her inability to see beyond.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a cautionary tale too about don't take on somebody else's trauma. Don't take on the full burden of somebody else's trauma. You can be there, you can be supportive with healthy boundaries, but if you lose yourself in somebody else's trauma, you're going to become an echo, if anything.
And that might be the moral of the people pleaser episode, is if we're so quick to just mirror whatever someone else is saying, to mirror that because we're so scared of losing that relationship. Echo needing to look at Narcissus all the time and having her identity wrapped up in that picture of the guy just looking at himself, never is going to feel love, because
Yeah.
there's not a true person on the other side if you're just reflecting back to them that's seeing you anyway. Because if Chris and I have a place where he sees what I feel and he sees what I think, and he only reflects that back to me, the moment that Chris has a difference of opinion, maybe 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the road, then where's the place where we've had differentiation? And I can actually say that there's a relationship there if it's just echoed back to me, right? But
Yeah.
when I see something else, something other that's presented, that's important to shape us and form us as humans, which is, and I don't want to just go back to the Facebook algorithm thing over and over again, but that is why it is so important for all of us to have people in our lives that don't believe the same thing as we do. I've got a bookshelf back here where I've got Anne Lamott and John Piper on the same bookshelf, because we need to surround ourselves by people who don't just believe the same things as we, invoke the same way, and the public discourse that we're having with others is vital. If you only have an echo chamber where you can hear yourself talking, you're not going to be a full self. How are you then selfless?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's well said. Thank you for saying that. And when I watched that skit, it resonated with me, but I did not put it into these words. And I think that you've done a really good job with like naming why I felt a certain type of way after I saw that too. And I laughed because I saw myself in it, and it was a funny sketch.
Thank you for giving me the space to just talk through it, because
Yeah.
I don't know that I had thought through it before extroverting to you just now.
Yeah. No, I
I
think it's
appreciate
great.
you giving me the space to allow me to do that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh man. Hey, anything final that you want to wrap up with? I think there's so many other things that we could talk about, but both of us as co-podcasters and you all listening probably don't have another hour to listen to us.
One thing I think that we could do, and I was doing this early on and I got away from it just with my schedule, but I think there's like this podcast, this episode in particular, there's so many interesting sections to it. And a lot of times what you're really good at is finding the shorts, and we post those, and sometimes those get a lot of traction, sometimes they don't. But I think that I could do a better job in my downtime of going back through and finding like the 3 or 4 minute clips that are like just self-contained, that I think if you don't have time to watch all 60 minutes of us being the worst, you can watch a couple minutes of us where we might be halfway decent.
Yeah, if you'd like to see more of that, vote it up on or make some comments if you want to see more of the long, not the long form, but the middle and the middling.
Yeah, just those little chunks, those little
5-minute version. Because again, like spending a whole hour with somebody may be a little hard. Spending 15 seconds, maybe a little less, but spending 5 to 10 minutes, maybe that's the right spot.
Yeah. But I'm really grateful, Nathan, that we have every week, we have this artifact to pull from, not just to figure out algorithms, but we can look back 10, 15 years from now and say, look at that conversation we had. Look who we were then. Look how we helped each other become who we are now. And if there are audience members who are part of that journey too, that's all the better. But I'm really grateful for it.
Thanks, man. I'm grateful for the space that we have too. So I think that's a good idea. Let's do it.
I will do my best to get on that.
All right, man. Have a great week.
You
can't wait to see you soon.
Likewise.